So today seminar is just a seminar that we have for a community development department. The intention of the seminar is just basically to educate the public on our current policies, procedures, and expectations of the city as it relates to construction in our jurisdiction. The information provided in this seminar is always subject to change as we adopt new policies and as codes change nationally, state, and locally. So today we're going to be talking about a practical guide designing around trees and water. A couple of logistics. So we have a mixed batch. I have a handful of people that are attending online and quite a few people here in the office as well. So if you have a question, if you're in person, just please raise your hand. And everybody that's online, if you look down here at the bottom, there's a Q&A button. Just go ahead and click that and type in your question. And we'll be monitoring that. And we'll repeat the question when the time comes up, when your question. And if you see somebody asking a question that you agree with, that you wanted to answer or ask as well, you can always one up that as well. So today, the intent of our seminar today is basically to answer a lot of our frequently asked questions. So we're going to break it down into two sessions. One about trees, designing around trees. And some of the common questions that we have are, can I remove trees? What is a hazardous tree? What if I have a dead tree? Do I need a tree removal permit? How do I apply for a tree removal permit? And how much does it cost? How do I measure a tree? What is canopy coverage? What are the requirements for it? How do I determine my coverage? What's in a tree conservation plan? And so on and so forth. And then the other half is design around water. Can I build around water? We'll discuss things such as what is a buffer? What are the different types of buffer? We have two main ones here. And how do I know if I'm in a buffer? We'll show you how to determine that. Can I request a type of variance or review? And do I need a permit? And what are the different construction methods and requirements when I submit my plans and when I start my construction? So with that, we're going to talk about designing with trees. I'm going to turn this over to Lindsay, who is our arborist.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lindsay. So a question I get a lot from people who want to move into the city are, can they remove trees on their property? So the simple answer is yes. You can always remove hazardous trees. There are some restrictions if you're within the Canopy corridor or you're within any stream buffers. But in general, you can remove trees on your property. If they are over 18 inches in diameter, they do have to be permitted with the city first. And then if you are within those stream buffers or within that river corridor, any size tree permit. What is a hazardous tree? So this is a common question we get. So hazardous is defined as a tree that is at risk of failure because it's structurally defective and where that failure is going to result in personal injury or property damage. This can be verified by a private arborist, and then they send that documentation to me for review. You can find a lot of arborists qualified in our area at this website right here. We included a picture where you can see it says find an arborist. You can search by zip code. So we have a few examples of hazardous trees. You can see right here, this tree is splitting. It's actually on Windsor Parkway. This is a tree that got hit by lightning. This is a tree that's leaning hazardously. You can see it's going right over that parking lot. This tree is obviously in decline. It's dying back significantly. We have evidence of mushrooms and conchs here. This is an indicator that the tree is in decline. And hollows and cankers, you can see this one actually was sent in just a few weeks ago. You can see how large that hollow is to the tree. So that's dangerous. So what if you have a dead tree? So a dead tree is on it. All you have to do, if it's something that would have required a permit, if it were alive, you just have to send us notification. So it's typically done by email, or they send a picture to the arborist at Sandy Springs GA email. Make sure to include the address. So do I need a tree removal permit? You will need a permit if you are removing a tree 18 inches in diameter and larger, or any size tree within a stream buffer or within the Chattahoochee River corridor. And I do get that question a lot. You can always call me and I can look up quite quickly if you're in a stream buffer in the corridor. This is something we check on GIS. How do I apply for a permit? We do have an application process. You can find everything on our website, but to apply for a tree removal permit, you will fill out that application, which is going to have the details about the trees. And you can upload that with your documentation, which could be pictures, a report, any information you think is important to our portal, which is build.sandspringsga.gov. Here's an example of the application that you can find on our website. And here's how you can apply. This is a screenshot from our portal. So you can see the middle top says apply. And once you go there, you can find the different types of permits to apply for. And you can see there's an option for tree removal. How much does a tree removal permit cost? So in general, it's going to be about $30. You can pay that in person or online. Online will have like a very minor technology fee. You will have, if you go under your canopy coverage requirements, there would be additional fees for canopy loss. That's if you would like to remove healthy trees under what you are required to keep on your property. And that's assessed at $1,200 per 1,000 square feet of canopy loss. How to measure trees. So trees are measured by DBH, which is diameter at rest height. If you go up to a tree, it's going to be right around your chest height. So you'll do the cross section of that tree. If you don't have a diameter tape, or if you don't want to use the cross section with a tape measure, you can go around the tree for the circumference, and then just divide it by pi to get the diameter size. How do I measure for a replacement tree? So all younger trees are going to be measured by caliper size, and that's just going to be about 6 to 12 inches off the ground. What is canopy coverage? So canopy coverage refers to the number of large trees shading your property. Most municipalities are going to have a requirement. For us in Sandy Springs, for residential property, ours is 35% made up of protected trees, which are 18 inches in diameter and larger. Commercial properties have a higher requirement of 40%. And we do review this by the information on the application.
Hey, Lindsay, we had a question that just came up.
Sure.
Back on the other slide. Somebody had a question about what is the $5,000 fee?
Sure, yes. So if you remove trees that go under your canopy requirements, you would pay that $1,200 figure for the 1,000 square feet of canopy loss, and you'd also have to replant trees. If you choose not to replant the tree, then that's where the $5,000 figure is used. So that's the option if you do not want to replant a mitigation tree.
And these are non-refundable, correct?
Correct.
Great, thanks.
So back to canopy coverage for residential properties, that's at 35%, and commercial properties at 40%. So what are the requirements and the mitigation and recompense? So when you go under your canopy coverage requirements, then you would have to mitigate and recompense that. Mitigation would be planting new trees. So that's any protected tree that goes under your requirements. Protected trees are 18 inches in diameter and larger, as well as landmark trees. Those have to be mitigated at 150%. Essentially, that means if you remove one landmark tree, you'll plant back 2 trees. The tree has to be mitigated with something of a similar growing potential. So if you remove an oak tree, you wouldn't be able to replant that with a dogwood, something that's going to get the same size.
All right, Lindsay, we have a few more questions coming in.
Sure.
So is the canopy coverage determined by the individual tree values or by the existing canopy square footage?
So we'll talk about that in just a minute. Essentially, any protected tree is going to give you 1,000 square feet of canopy coverage. And I do have some calculations coming up that better explain that.
All right, and we have another question from Peggy. Says, when you replant a small tree, when it's a huge tree is taken down, or I guess that's the question is, do you have to replace it with the same size tree or a smaller tree?
So any mitigation trees that get planted would be either a 2-inch or a 2.5-inch caliber. They tend to be on the smaller size, and they'll be about 15 feet tall. And really that decision helps maintain the tree. If you replant these large trees that are 10, 15 inches in diameter, it takes a long time for them to be established. It takes a lot of maintenance to keep them alive.
And what's the difference between the 2 and 2.5-inch tree?
So for some setback mitigations, a 2-inch tree is required. For any other mitigations for canopy coverage, it's 2.5 inches. And that's the caliper size measured about 12 feet or 12 inches from the base of the tree.
All right, great. Thank you.
Recompense is the payment into the tree fund for canopy loss. So again, that's factored at $1,200 per 1,000 square feet, or essentially one healthy protected tree that's removed under your canopy coverage requirements. This is an example of our recommended large canopy species list. So when you have mitigation trees that are required, they have to be considered a large canopy to mitigate the loss. And we do have a larger list in our technical manual that gives an idea of options you can choose from.
So does it have to be the same type of tree? If I cut down a white oak, do I have to replace it with a white oak?
You don't have to do the same species, but it'd be something of the same growing potential. So it needs to get as big as a white oak.
Okay, thanks.
How to determine canopy coverage. So each protected tree, which is an 18-inch in diameter larger tree, count towards 1,000 square feet for canopy. So you would take your lot size in square feet, which I believe is on the next slide, and multiply that by your requirements. So that's going to be 0.35 for residential. So if you have 7 protected trees, you'll have 7,000 square feet of canopy. And if you have an 18,000 square foot lot, then you would meet your canopy coverage requirements.
Lindsay, we had another question came in. Someone asked, can I plant 2 smaller canopy trees to replace 1 large canopy tree?
No, so it would have to be something that's of a similar growing potential. Because even if you plant, 2 crepe myrtles, 2 dogwoods, that's still not going to provide the same canopy that you get from like a landmark oak tree.
Great, thanks.
So you compare what you have in your canopy versus what's required. And if you have the 7 trees in that 18,000 square foot lot, your canopy coverage requirements are satisfied, and there's nothing additional that's required. But if you're less than that, then you're going to have to pay for any removal of protected trees that are healthy, and you'll have to replant as well. So when you have any type of exterior construction permit, you do have to provide a tree conservation plan to include calculations that show this information.
Do we have to have a separate tree removal permit for new construction, BR or BC?
So if you already have a building permit, land disturbance, pool permit, all of that will show the tree removals. You do not need a separate tree removal permit.
So that's included with the main permit?
That's correct. It is included in your building permit. So What is a tree conservation plan and what does that look like? I'm not gonna read through all of this, but this is outlining everything that we need to see on a tree conservation plan, which will be existing trees, the critical root zone, any trees that are impacted, as well as the Canopy coverage requirements.
Can you explain to people how to calculate the critical root zone?
Yes, for Sandy Springs, we calculated at 1¼ feet per 1 inch of diameter. Different municipalities have different requirements based on the, if it's urban or more suburban. So you would do, the diameter times 1.25 feet to get the critical root zone, and that's represented with a circle, and that's measured from the center of the tree.
Right. So in this example, if you have an 18-inch diameter tree, you multiply that times 1.25, it gives you a 22.5 critical root zone. But just to be clear, what that is, that's actually twice the size circle.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
Right. So that would be a 45-foot circle around the center of the tree, just so we're all clear about that.
Yeah, but if you're doing the radius, yeah, that's measured from the center, so it's gonna go out 22.5 feet all around the tree.
Right.
We also have to see boundary trees, which are going to be neighboring trees that may be impacted by any type of construction. If you are removing trees, that should be represented with an X. And then we'll also need to see any type of mitigation trees that you're planting, need the species, the caliper size, and the location on the plans. All construction permits must include a tree conservation plan, which will outline the work that's being done. If you are doing work that's really not impacting many trees, you can show any trees in the vicinity of the work. And if we can see if you're not impacting anything, then you can talk that out with us and we can get a note on the plan to address it.
So basically what you're saying is if I'm just adding an accessory structure, then I only need to show the trees that are adjacent to the accessory structure?
If you're not impacting any trees.
Okay.
If you are impacting any trees, we'll need to see that tree conservation plan. But for instance, if someone's building a deck and there's not many trees around, then you would not have to do the full tree conservation plan.
All right.
So what does a plan look like? So if we have our Canopy coverage requirements at the top here, you can see they're Xing out the trees to be removed. In green, we have the new proposed trees. The critical root zones are those circles right here. And then we can see they're talking about the tree impact. We also have the details for tree planting and tree safe fencing, which is important to have in the field for your workers. And we see at the bottom, the replacement trees proposed based on the work they're doing.
So Lindsay, on this, is the critical root zone, is that basically the, well, that's how they need to show it on the plan. It's just a circle like this.
Yep, so this is the critical root zone of the tree. It looks like they're also showing the structural root plate, which other municipalities require, but we do not. So all they have to show is this larger circle, which is the critical root zone.
And if you have one that's on your neighbor's property, but their critical root zone overlaps onto your property, what do you do?
So you do have to show that because we'll need to address any impact. So we can see right here, this is just a concrete driveway in the neighbor's yard. But if there were any trees around this area, we would need to see that. Yes, Gail. Yes, Gail asked if this is just an excerpt from a tree conservation plan. That is correct. So in general, we do need to see the full property for your tree plan. But we just did a little excerpt of this to show some important information. Thank you, Gail.
And Lindsay, we have a couple of other questions that came in.
Okay.
It says, aside from the type of tree selected, what other restrictions exist when replanting trees? Can these be placed in the setback?
Yes, trees can be placed in the setback. So really the only restrictions, we would have guidelines to keep it away from impervious areas, keep it away from utilities, underground and overhead. Beyond that, we can really discuss what the best options are to make sure that these trees thrive.
All right, another question is, if a tree is knocked down by environmental factors and causes obstructions on a roadway or house, does it need a permit?
No, if a tree has already fallen down, it does not need a permit.
Great, thanks.
So this is a good example of how to show impact for a tree. So we can see here they have their BMPs in place, which is their silt fence and their tree safe fencing. And then they're proposing to do a water quality pit there. So if we look at the details of the water quality pit, we'll get an idea of how deep they're digging and other details. So we know they're going to be excavating this area. And overall, this impact is very minimal, but this is why it's important to maintain your BMPs, because if someone decided to put their tree safe fence close to the tree, we could end up with something like this below. We have a lot of root impact, and the tree would essentially be destroyed.
Is there a particular way that the customers need to show the area of impact? I know you showed it here, shaded in red. How would it typically be shown on a drawing?
A lot of design professionals will crosshatch it, and then they'll always list out on the plans, either in a table or on here, you can see that it just has a square where it shows impacted area. So for this example right here, they're showing the impacted area is 7%. So what's a tree safe fence? So this is part of your BMPs. It's going to be this orange fence, and it's extremely important to keep that maintained, as well as any other erosion control methods. You can see we have a lot of impacted trees because their BMPs were not maintained. With this first one, we can see they used machinery to go around this tree since it was not protected. We have a lot of fill dirt that was piled up against this tree and material that was piled up against this tree. You know, when you're doing construction on a site and you want to put something down, usually you're going to go towards the tree where there's shade. So this is why it's important to maintain your BMPs so you protect those areas.
Lindsay, what's the problem with pushing dirt up against a tree when it's already in the ground?
Well, with that, you are compacting the critical root zone, essentially just suffocating out the roots. It's very significant impact for a tree. You'll also have root rot issues, especially having so much dirt piled against the trunk of the tree. So why should we protect our trees? They're vital to our environment. In Sandy Springs, we do have, flooding issues, and we have a lot of creeks that we want to protect. So stormwater is one of the #1 impairments in urban areas. So trees are really going to help mitigate that. They stabilize the soil, they'll stabilize stream banks, they'll intercept rainfall, so we won't get erosion from that, and it's going to filter through that stormwater runoff. Here's an example of a more urban area. We can see there's not as much infiltration when there's a lot of impervious area. When you have more trees, it's just going to help a lot more dealing with stormwater runoff and other environmental factors. And then they improve air quality by filtrating dust and improving conditions. They can also mitigate the urban heat effect by shading and providing a buffer. So we can see on this graph here how it's going to get a lot hotter when you don't have many trees around. In response to that, you're also going to see a lot more pest and disease issues when you have hotter temperatures in urban areas. And then they'll provide habitat for desirable wildlife by providing food, shelter, nesting sites, and it just improves quality of life overall. Do we have any more questions about trees or a tree conservation plan? Yes.
My neighbor has a tree that is starting to lean on my property. Does it get involved with that type of thing?
That's a great question. So the question is, what if you're tree that's starting to lean over your property, potentially causing a hazard. So that is something that's viewed as a civil issue. So you can call in for recommendations, but I always say is to send a certified letter. You might want to get an arborist out there to document it, and then put that neighbor on notice that this is a concern, and that they need to address it.
Then we have another question online. It says, what do you do when you have maintained your barriers, but there are still massive roots disturbed within the designated area of disturbance? Roots that seem too big to be lost, i.e. the disturbance is still under 25%.
Okay, that's a great question. So in that case, it would be, we do have a lot of consulting arborists who work in Sandy Springs in Atlanta. And their focus is really on helping preserve trees during the construction process. So they would likely have a prescription program to help address that. Usually a growth regulator, root pruning, things of that nature, just to help the tree stabilize and survive. All trees are different, so the critical root zone will be different, depending on the area you're in, if you're by a house or in the woods. So every tree is different, and the same prescription is not going to work for everything. But I would always recommend to get one of those private arborists involved if you have concerns and you want to save a tree.
And another question came up, says, what if you do not have express permission to conduct a tree survey on an adjacent property for boundary trees? Are estimations acceptable in that condition?
Yes, so we assume that it's going to be estimated because the surveyor is not going to be able to go on the neighbor's property. But surveyors do this all the time, so they can have a good idea of the size of the trees that are across the property lines.
All right. Another question is, are there any other options rather than paying into the tree fund if you have a lost tree on paper, but you don't want to cut it down or consider it a loss or pay the $5,000?
We do not have any other options. So if you go below those canopy coverage requirements, you do have to pay that $1,200 into the tree fund as well as replant the tree.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you. I believe we're turning it over to Jesus Davila now to talk about designing around the water.
Thank you, Lindsay. All right. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Jesus Davila, I'm the land development manager here at the city of Sandy Springs. And we're going to talk about what you do around water. So the big question, of course, is can I build around water? Just like can I build around trees? General answer is yes. And again, the same principles apply. So if you're within the 2,000 feet of the river corridor, you have to make additional precautions, regulations apply. Likewise, if you're within the stream buffers, we'll get into the specific specificity of the stream buffers in a little bit. But that too, there's no construction allowed within 75 feet of a stream or creek. So then the big question is, what's a buffer? So in reality, it's actually pretty simply defined. As you can see here in the picture, where we have existing vegetation and then roots, dirt, everything that has scoured away from the water, the banks of this water. And so this is just a simple creek, no big deal here. So what we're showing here is, again, it's just where that vegetation has been rested away or scoured away from the actual stream bed. But we measure our buffers, 75 feet here in Sandy Springs from that edge towards the property. So here's a quick example on our screen here. We blew it up so you can see a little bit better. Apologize, I've got my pointer on this side. So as you can see, there's a couple lines here on the screen itself. Towards the bottom dark line, you'll see the stream, and it actually goes up towards the right. And then we have a couple of buffers. Starting from the bottom, there's a 25-foot state waters buffer, a 50-foot, undisturbed buffer, and then beyond that, we have a 75-foot impervious buffer where some grading and additional work can be done, but no construction or structures can be located there. So, all right, so what are the different types of buffers? Like I mentioned before, we have the Chattahoochee River, and then we also have stream buffers. So in very general terms here in the Chattahoochee, you can't build within 50 feet of the vegetative buffer. Additionally, the 150-foot impervious surface, again, some minor grade, minor work, but it can't do anything else beyond that. And then going further from that, we've got the 35-foot undisturbed vegetative buffers. And these are the perennial tributary streams within the corridors extending out 2,000 feet from either bank of the river. Okay. Now, what is the buffers that we talked about? Well, the Chattahoochee goes all the way north into Helen, where it starts, but officially, sorry about that. The river corridor actually starts from Beaufort Dam south through our counties all the way down into Douglas and Fulton counties. Okay. So now we talk about streams and creeks. Well, this is what predominates most of the water bodies here in Sandy Springs. So we have three different types of streams. As customers, clients, residents of the city, if you're interested in finding out what type of stream you have, look over this what we have on screen, but you're welcome to get in contact with us here at the city, and we can speak to our Chief Environmental Compliance Officer, James Sanders. He is actually the one noted here in the city that can make that determination. So very quickly, ephemeral streams are those streams that only have water just after rain event. So like today, rainy day, you're gonna have streams full of water everywhere, okay? Now, if you come back, say tomorrow's a clear day or 2 days later is a clear day and that stream no longer has water, nor, one thing to keep in mind, there is no rested vegetation, then it's an ephemeral stream, okay? Intermittent streams, again, they work with the water table, always some kind of water in that area. At some time during the year, but not constantly. But again, there is specific characteristics to follow. Perennial streams, the Chattahoochee is a prime example. There's water in it all the time, right? So for buffer purposes, see on this screen, I don't know why this microphone is acting up a little bit. So we're going to switch out. Okay, all right, a little bit easier. So for ephemeral streams, they don't have buffers. So again, once that determination is made, construction can happen, very close to it. But once we do get into the intermittent and perennial streams, they do have buffers. As you see on your screen here, we've got the three buffers that we have to abide by. First is the 25-foot state buffer that's affected on it. And then from there, we have the 50-foot city undisturbed buffer. And then finally, it's the 75-foot the 75-foot impervious buffer, where again, minor grading can occur but no construction activities can be permitted. How do I know we have a buffer? So just like we talked back about the previous screens, you can do that quick assessment, contact the city if you have any real questions. But then beyond that, we do have a tool on our GIS. So on our screen here is actually a location sketch from the GIS. As you can see, the buffers are clearly marked now. Important thing to note about this is only an approximation. In order to determine the actual location of the buffers, you have to have a surveyor go out, mark these buffers and provide that information on your plans.
And again, Jesus, that buffer is from the rest of vegetation, is that correct?
That's correct.
That's where it begins, not from the center line?
Correct. It's rested vegetation outward on both sides of the bank.
Great, thanks.
All right, can I request a buffer variance? So this is a two-part question. So the first one is, for city buffers, yes, you can request a variance. There's lots of information that we have to consider. And again, we look at topography and everything else if it's pre-existing in 2005. And then, from there, there's strict adherence to the minimal buffers and setback requirements, and you have to prove an extreme hardship. So then continue on from there, there are specific fees. This is something that does go before the Board of Appeals here at Sandy Springs. And again, the fees are dependent upon the location of the properties. Now, river protection does not have a buffer, but there are properties that may wish to have a view review. And so within the Metropolitan River Protection Act, which we follow, because we're right on the Chattahoochee, you have to go through and present not only your existing conditions, which is disturbed and impervious areas, but also those same proposed locations and circumstances. There is a mountable fee. Here at the city, it's $500. There's an additional cost that the ARC determines. Now, this goes through a formal review process by the Atlanta Regional Commission, which ultimately then comes back to the city and has to be reviewed and approved by Mayor and City Council. This is actually a public hearing process. Council and the mayor and city council has the priorities and obligation to present this case before the public.
So Jesus, does this MRPA, does that only apply to the houses that are actually on the river?
This applies to any parcel of land that is 2,000 feet from the Chattahoochee.
So that could be 2, 3, 4 streets over?
It could be, if you were to consider a linear mile is 5,280 feet from the river, so we're about a half a mile.
Half a mile away?
So any property within that, and again, if we go into our GIS, you're able to go ahead and click on the layer and see in a hashed area how that shows up, and if your property is or is not in the river corridor. So here on your screen, you have the two ways to do so. These are both active links, and you can go ahead and get the application for the city buffer, and then review questions regarding the Metropolitan River Protection Act. So do I need a permit? Oh, yes, ma'am.
You might like to point out that a lot of the properties in
Sure.
Can you repeat the question?
Okay. So question here live was, is my property, in the river corridor, has it been reviewed? And the honest answer is yes. Most properties, if not all properties, have been reviewed since 1974. And then that information would be kept here at the city. If we don't have immediate records here, we would reach out to the Atlanta Regional Commission to get that data and then be able to determine what the allocations or what requirements and classifications are there for the river corridor to that specific property.
Hey, Suze, we got another question that came in. It says, does the city trump the ARC? Can the city approve something that the ARC does not?
We cannot. We are part of the coordinating systems of municipalities along the river that have to abide by river corridor requirements. So we cannot grant any deviation from that.
Great, thanks.
All right, so again, when you're permit, simple answer is yes. You could build within these, in this case, you can actually go through, and the only questions, of course, if you are, again, just to reiterate, we're not building in the buffers, we can build into the ARC if the allotment requirements are met, and we have extra area to be able to work in. So simple thing about the permits is if you're creating 1,000 square feet or more of impervious cover, you're gonna need to get a land disturbance permit. If your overall land disturbance activity is 2,500 square feet or more, that too will require a land disturbance permit. And if we go back to the first bullet point here it's replacement or new. So it's new or improved impervious areas.
So if I replace my driveway, does that count?
Driveways, if they're replaced in kind, we consider it maintenance. But if someone wants to deviate, move, shift,
Enlarge.
add a turnaround, those kind of things would require any permit.
And same question as before, do I have to get a land disturbance permit for a new construction? Or would that be included as part of the BR permit?
Yeah, so if you have an existing residential permit, commercial permit, the land disturbance associated with that does not require a separate permit. If what your work entails strictly is land disturbance, then yes, you have to get a separate permit for that. All right, quick point of reference here for commercial properties, most commercial properties will require a separate land disturbance permit in addition to just building the structure itself.
Then we had another question that came in related to the ARCs. Like, do you know anywhere to buy rights to E or F property in the MRPA?
We have had this question come up. Unfortunately, we don't have a list of what properties have those expendable rights or transferable rights. But again, it's something that we can consider if someone is asking a question. They can come talk to us and we'll start some review process for it. But there is no designated bank where I can grab monies from or designation from.
Great.
All right. So what plans do I need to submit to get a permit? So typically what we ask for is a site plan. That's the most important thing here. And as you see on screen, it's pretty simple. Show me what you're proposing, show me what's out there today. I need to see trees, what's going to be coming in, what's being removed. I need to see your buffers, whether you're in the river, whether you're on a creek, whether you have both on your properties. And then from there, we need to see your zoning calculations, which will go into a question, or zoning information and stormwater calculations, along with the ARC classification. Because this determines how much area you can and cannot disturb. Okay? And finally, all construction activities are details that we have to submit for trees, as we mentioned earlier, stormwater regulations that we'll talk to in a few minutes, and then construction related activities.
If I'm not in the ARC, do I have to show this information?
If you are not in the ARC, you do not have to submit information for the ARC, but you do have to provide all the rest that's on this page at a minimum. Again, each site is unique. We may have additional requirements and questions that come up. And, we do have to make sure the information that we have presented is true and factual and makes sense for the additions on the site. So here's an idea, for example, site plan that we have here. I'll kind of just point to the red markings that we have on screen here. For example, the top one here is the zoning information that we have showing existing conditions, i.e. lot coverage, number, square footage of impervious, and everything else. We have a proposal to put in a pool, which is the center block here, so we know what that word entails. And then towards the bottom left of the screen, you'll see there's a box that says category E and then category C just to the right of that. Those are the river corridor classifications, and each one has specific requirements for disturbance. And then last but not least, there actually is a breakup, a blow up here at the bottom right, which actually talks about the specifics for the classification itself.
Is this presentation going to be online?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We are, as all seminars, we are going to put this online for the public's review in the future and for whatever information they'd like to gather down the road.
Yeah, we will post a copy of PDFs of this seminar online as well.
All right. Next slide, here's where we get back to the construction details. So what we've got here, just from the top to the bottom, we've got some construction details relating to the entrance of the property to alleviate some erosion. We have the tree details on the bottom left. We have some stormwater calculations and information on the center. And again, some more details to the left. So this is your construction details page that would be required. Next slide would be. All right, so what are water quality requirements? What do we mean by this? Basically, every property in Sandy Springs, as we see today, rain falls on.
Hey, since we had another question came in.
Yep.
We have an impervious surface question. What is the current impervious surface percentage allowed? And is it different for an existing home, such as I want to add a pool and pool house to my current home versus new construction where they clear cut the lot and rebuild a McMansion with a pool, etc.?
They're both the same. They all have the same requirements. We would use existing conditions on the existing home. We make those calculations known. And then likewise, if someone's coming in for new disturbance, that area of disturbance has to be calculated as well. Yeah, and specifically, from the crowd here, it is actually based on your zoning district. Each zoning district has a specific calculation for impervious, which is called lot coverage.
Right, and you can find out a lot of this information too on some of our previous seminars and also on the Build at Sandy Springs website. We kind of keep everything on that as your go-to determine what you're allowed to do. The lower section, I think, is the development code, which will tell you what all those requirements are based on your zoning.
Right. All right, so real quick, very straightforward. We've had this question come up a lot. Well, we're trying to build according to the Blue Book. The Blue Book is the Georgia Stormwater Management Manual. Now, it is true, the state requires every municipality to follow the Blue Book. But the code itself allows municipalities, based on their specific and unique circumstances, to have additional policies in place and potentially stricter regulations, which what we have in Sandy Springs. It is the job and requirement of your design professional to look at current site conditions, compliance with the Blue Book, and compliance with city ordinances. We've had a lot of circumstances where someone just applies to the Blue Book and disregards the cities, intentionally or not, which we then have to follow back through and puts additional delays on your project. Now, from a very standard and general format, stormwater itself just has to capture and treat the first 1.2 inch rain that falls on the property before it gets discharged off. Very general. There's other more specific requirements that we'll talk about. In the city, we actually do have two additional areas to consider. So Nancy Creek, which we'll get to in the next slide, is an additional treatment measure, or additional treatment measures are needed for Nancy Creek because of flooding and localized information here that happens from the stormwater standpoint. Marsh Creek, likewise, it's a regional detention pond here. in downtown or centralized Sandy Springs, which does affect those properties, and I'll define that in just a second.
So Jesus, we had another question come in. It says, can you do an administrative variance for a small increase in impervious max?
I don't remember the actual answer to that. I don't think it's part of the requirements. There is an administrative variance in our city's code, but I believe that's actually standards like setbacks.
Yes.
I'm not sure if lot coverage would be under that category.
Yeah.
There may be some mitigation requirements that could be met. Oh, that is true.
Plus
So if you
5%.
go above- Right.
Yeah.
So if you go plus 5% of what's required, you do have to provide some additional mitigation, and that's stormwater mitigation.
Right, yeah, we do have an allowance for going above 5%, but then there's additional mitigation, like Jesus said, that will be required if you do go above that, but that's the max. We had another question that came up from maybe one of Lindsay's slides. So measuring the structural root plate, is the radius considered measured from the radius point of the trunk or from the outer surface of the tree? This is considerably different result for large trees.
So in Sandy Springs, we do not measure the structural root plate, and we do not need to see that on the plans. Other municipalities will have requirements for it, but we specifically do not.
All right, great.
All right, so next slide, there's again, a quick information. So what you all see on screen here, which is actually noted in a pinkish color or a beige color, depending on your monitor. And what we have here, this is the declared sensitive area. Again, the Nancy Creek declared sensitive area. And this is to address the additional impact that we've seen, the flooding that has occurred along Nancy Creek. For those of you that may or may not be familiar, Nancy Creek actually runs along the bottom portion of the city limits, but all of this area drains into those tributaries and eventually into the river, causing that localized flooding in situations where we had to take a more proactive approach. So again, as you see on screen, it defines where it is. You can see it graphically. If you go on our GIS, it is an observable layer. So it gives you an idea if your property is in or outside of the Nancy Creek sensitive area. Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to advise realtors that they could inquire that they're involved in this, you know, to find out whether the land is.
Okay, good point. The point here in person is actually just to make sure our real estate community and contractors in general should really look into our code to make sure that this property is or is not, and properly advise your customers. The reason being is because of the additional requirements for stormwater, it would impact what could or could not be built on the property.
So the city has a pamphlet that says if you live in this area, here's all the rules that follow.
We do have it, it's actually a policy, and then we can provide that to anyone that inquires what those requirements are.
Yep, and we have a copy of that also on that Build at Sandy Springs website. Links back to the development code and the technical manual that we have for the city.
So really quickly explain what the Marsh Creek rain garden is. So this is a regional detention for properties, as you see here, it's 32 acres. It spans most of downtown Sandy Springs. It comes from Roswell to the east, Mount Vernon to the south, and then Sandy Springs circles to the west. This is unique because the way this was designed is for persons, forgive me, and properties that are located in this area would actually be able to utilize the stormwater mitigation that this provides. There is a fee that is submitted to the city for the use of the pond itself, and then a perpetual maintenance fee that is also included. And it's based on the acreage that's being disturbed for those sites. All right, so we'll kind of run through this. This is just a visual representation of what kind of devices that we have for water quality. When somebody just says, what's a water quality device? Nobody knows. All right. So we got 4 on the list here. An infiltration trench is probably the predominant thing. Basically, it's just a giant hole that's dug into the ground. You know, it's filled with gravel. There's voids within that it lets the water infiltrate into the ground. The important thing here about infiltration trenches and all the practices we're going to talk about is a surveyor or a geotechnical engineer has to go out and make sure that the infiltration location meets the city's requirements. Because again, if you've got a pit that's on top of rock, it's not going to infiltrate. So they have to be able to prove that it could percolate and infiltrate into the ground. The next one here, these are examples of flow wells. Flow wells are passive devices. They're basically, it's a cavern. Water flows into it, eventually drains out through the holes, weeps into the ground, and then eventually goes back into a water table. The larger structures, these are typically subdivisions, commercial properties. They have these underground detention systems. These are giant vaults. Same purpose. Water goes into them, takes up that necessary volume, eventually seeps into the ground before it discharges at a rate that's required by code. All right, now we get into green infrastructure. This is what helps most homeowners. Yes, yeah. Of course, thank you. Good point. Good point. For typical, Jonathan, we go back up to the rain barrels or the flow wells. So good point. Thank you, Gail, for bringing this up. So what happens here is rainwater is captured from any hard surface on your property, typically your rooftops, your driveways, and even the pool. I mean, because again, the pool is just a bowl in the ground. Everybody says, well, there's water in my pool. Well, yes, but it's a concrete bowl. Water doesn't go through it. If it did, you don't have a pool.
And pools overflow.
Yeah, so, and here's what we've got. So again, the scenario is that all of these areas actually are directed by a series of underground pipes to these structures, whether it's a trench or these flow wells or the underground detention systems. And eventually that water is collected, drained appropriately before it actually leaves those structures and goes out into our creeks and waterways. The intent behind this is twofold. One, it helps to alleviate the amount of water that goes into our systems and keeps it on site. And the second one, it does provide what is water quality. You know, it allows some of that additional materials or sediment, things of that nature to come into these systems and be able to not go into our streams and rivers. All right, so go down to green infrastructure. All right, so this is one of the important things that we have here, and recently we've adopted the green infrastructure manual, and it helps folks look at specifically ways to do this in a natural sense or more economic than some of these other products that we've just shown. So, for example, green infrastructure is where we would use, green infrastructure is where we would use runoff that comes off the site already for irrigation purposes. If we have things such as, again, you have a garden and you have the structure, you can use some of that water that comes off. A lot of places would do it for these purposes. See, same thing. So next slide, please. All right. Again, like I mentioned, different ways to be able to do these green infrastructure practices. One is conservation of soil. If we keep the land natural and undisturbed, it's going to work its best work. So that's why it's there. So in a natural sense, we have these pastures, green areas, replanting of trees. Those would actually be your best form of green infrastructure. From there, we go to constructed. These are things obviously that you have to include on your property to be able to construct for them to function. And we'll go into detail in a few slides here. So again, natural occurrence, no maintenance required, if any. This is just leave it as it is. It works. That's what nature intended. Okay. Rain barrels. This is what we talk about water harvesting. So a lot of folks, for example, you see here, the gentleman in the background, he's sitting there, he's using this rain barrel to collect the water that comes off his roof, his deck, and is able to use it to water his garden. So again, that's what the calculations we do provide. So some of these things, again, are for small footprint projects. You know, they're minimal maintenance. You can buy this at any of your home improvement stores. You can buy them online, and it does serve that purpose. Here's your drywall that we just talked about before. Again, you can see the cross section here with the drywall that's underground. Everything comes off of this pipe on the right side of the screen into the drywall. You see the rock behind it, lets it all filter out into the subsurface, and then be able to continue on. Now, these do require maintenance. So the out of sight, out of mind is pretty straightforward. It's no longer worry about it, but you do have to have some form of observation for it to make sure it's still functioning. If it fails, if it caves in, it has to be replaced.
How do you prevent leaves from going in? Would that clog it up?
There are several practices, like let's say this pipe on the right-hand side of the screen actually comes from a downspout. There are downspout disconnects. There's actually leaf catchers. And they're able to divert those leaves out into the ground and let the water seep through to continue on.
So these would be like gutter screens?
There are gutter screens, yes.
Do you require to install gutter screens?
We are required, yes. You have to have that same information on your plans, and it has to be shown on the field before our site inspectors pass that inspection. All right, same thing. Here's a modified trench drain, and what this is really, it's a small trench where we have a perforated pipe at the very bottom. It collects water that comes into it, drains out slowly, but is able to then percolate into the ground around it. Again, same thing, out of sight, out of mind, but does require maintenance as it does clog up. Rain gardens, here's a good example at the bottom. I think this is up at Morgan Falls. There's a prime example of the city's rain garden here at the bottom right. And what it does is there's engineered slope here, which does allow one, vegetation to grow on top of it, but two, is engineered to allow that infiltration of water and rainwater, excuse me, to go through this engineered soil, be able to go into the substructure and into the area. And same thing, vegetative strips are the same idea. Their information, as you can see on this bottom picture, it's basically designed for water flow off of parking areas into this vegetated strip. Then eventually will get treated and all the pollutants get collected in the soil itself. These vegetative measures, so the strip and the rain gardens do have to be maintained just like any other structure, because that engineered soil will absorb the particulate matter. They'll get clogged and they're not performing to their expectation.
How often do you have to maintain them?
The design professional that says, this is what practice I'm going to install on your property, should also provide a maintenance schedule. And they determine it how often you need to have this soil reviewed and then ultimately replaced.
Is that monitored by the city?
It is not. The city looks at the practice, make sure it's properly installed at the beginning of the inspection, but as you're beginning of the process, but as you continue on with your home, your commercial project, it is the obligation of the property owner to make sure these are followed through. Pervious pavers. A lot of folks ask us, well, I can't replace my driveway, or what other measures can I do? You can use pervious pavers. So long as you follow the city's requirements for pervious pavers, this will be a 1-for-1 calculation to reduce your impervious counts. So if you have 1,000 square feet of impervious that you're removing, you put pavers, you don't need any additional information, no additional BMPs or other products to install.
Does the city have a particular pervious paver standard?
We do. When someone comes into the city, applies for a permit, we do provide them with the city's pervious paver detail. Or if anyone asks us for it, we provide it as well. Correct. The technical manual does actually blow it up as well. It shows the information about it. So ultimately, why are we here? We talked about why trees are important. Now, why are buffers important? You know, buffers provide that segue between our built environment and nature. So buffers are intended to try to mitigate the impact that we as humans, as construction activities, pose on nature. So again, very simple pictures here. These are the typical types of pollutant sources that we see in the city. And we all see them. There's a sewer pipe that breaks, now we got raw sewer going into the streets, eventually goes into our streams and rivers. Oh, yeah, I just hit something and I got oil coming out of my car, gas coming out of my car. Again, animal waste, you don't think that would make too much of an issue, but it does. We do have fecal coliform and additional other bacteria that forms on there that can then be washed off into our rivers and streams. Paint, my contractor just took care of painting my house, it looks beautiful. He's out there on the road washing off his brushes. No, that is a direct pollutant source, okay? Suds form, these are actually surfactants that's formed by detergents or other type of minerals, typically nitrogen based, that actually do provide its negative effect to our streams and rivers. And ultimately it's just trash. We see as you're driving down the road, somebody throws out the window, cigarette butts, a cup, whatever it is, all of that eventually is going to get into our streams and rivers. We don't want that.
Is there a penalty for doing something like this? Or what if I see somebody doing this?
Good question. See, call it in. And yes, there is a penalty. If someone is charged for illicit discharge, our code enforcement office goes out there, they do write them a citation. This is illegal. You cannot do this, and the city code has penalties that can be enforced.
Who's responsible for this illicit discharge during construction? Say if I own the property, but my builder is building my house.
Very good question. So ultimately, the homeowner, we'll say homeowner in this case for residential property, is responsible for their site. As a permitted process and a permitted site, the contractor is also responsible for that citation if that is the issue. Typically, our inspectors, again, if it is a blatant disregard for code, will cite the contractor, whoever's out there. It could be, again, we'll say the paint contractor. They'll be cited and has to go to court. If we cannot reach these individuals, that burden falls on the homeowner. So eventually someone will have to address this issue. All right, so here's some examples. For example, what we have here, as you can see on the right, we have fish kill. This happens when we have, for example, it's algae based, it could be too much sediment clogging up, their gills or oxygen levels are depleted, therefore they just die off. On the left-hand side, we do see this silt curtain that is coming. I don't want to confuse it with a B&B, but this is the silt that's intruding into, we'll call this a Chattahoochee, but that impact. This is where all this sediment is going into our river bodies. It is clogging up the system. It's then causing all this additional systems or damage to our ecosystems. All right, algae is another potential. With the higher concentration of nutrients in our water, you're going to have issues with algae. Algae causes fish kill. Algae actually eliminates the water from getting its needed, sun that goes in. There's aquatic life, there's aquatic plants underneath this. Algae actually puts a curtain on top of that and kills all of these activities. And again, when it dies, it goes down to the bottom and creates an anaerobic effect, which actually kills the oxygen, further damaging our ecosystem. So why are buffers important? If all of this information happens and we're able to keep our river streams and lakes clean, we have the places where we can enjoy ourselves. We have a place to enjoy nature and wildlife. But if we don't, we're going to end up, this same effect actually goes into our water systems, because all of our water either comes from Lake Lanier here in Sandy Springs, which is through the Chattahoochee, or at Lake Altoona. Those are our main sources of water. So therefore, if we do not maintain the situation, we're going to be the ones getting sick, having a lot more disease, and being further impacted by its buffers, by this pollution. All right, typical examples in construction sites. Again, the first picture here on the left is paint being dropped on the road right in front of the house. That will eventually leach in. We have soils that have been eroded away and running straight into a storm drain pipe. Those BMPs, the best management practices that were put in place, have failed. So all that mud is going right into our systems. And last but not least, this is what's called mud tracking. It's where equipment doesn't go over the appropriate measures. There's a construction entrance, which is typically gravel based, and all the mud just runs into the road. The moment the rain hits it, and it goes to our streams and rivers. All right. We do have some solutions, like we mentioned in other presentations, that we have. In this case, on our top picture, we have silt fence, we have stabilization with straw and hay. On the bottom side, we have matting blankets. These are all things to prevent and minimize the amount of erosion that happens on property. As we all know, rain hits it, that starts to place in the soil. That soil then continues to wash off. So these practices are in place to, again, minimize the disturbed areas.
If you see mud running down or discolored water, some red water running down during a rain event, is that an illicit discharge?
It is not, but it should at least be concerned. You should contact the city for us to further investigate.
How can you tell the difference between illicit discharge and just red water?
As a homeowner, it's very difficult, and again, because the moment we live in a very red clay soil area, I mean, clay by nature, super fine particles, at the moment water hits it, will start running. And the moment you have water, just take your cup of coffee this morning or your cup of tea, the moment you have anything in it, it changes the color. And clay being so red, so orangey, it's clearly visible. But that doesn't mean that there's immediate threat to our area, because you might have some discolored water. What we're talking about is, again, going back to the previous picture, we have this mud, we have this transmission and migration of soils that are coming off sites into that. Colored water may just, again, be a staining, which there really are no BMPs to accommodate that stain.
But if you see mud tracking, then that would,
Correct.
a residue left behind.
Please feel free to call the call center, and the number for the call center is 770-730-5600, and they can actually put in a ticket for that. Last of our slides, so I open up the floor for questions. Yes, ma'am.
Just want to mention that we have a written manual there for homeowners and also.
So from here in-house, we do just again want to reiterate that we do have a great infrastructure manual. It is intended for residential property. It is intended to help homeowners and the contracting community provide those BMPs on those types of sites. And please use them. It's cheaper, it's more efficient, and we provide you calculations on what it is you need.
It looks nicer.
Other questions? Any questions online?
Yeah, we have two more. One is, when planting in these areas, do you plant native plants?
Always. The city requires that you plant native species, you cannot plant non-native species.
And another question that came in, pervious pavers equals artificial turf installed as pervious pavers? I guess the question is artificial turf.
They can be, we would need to see the manufacturer's specification on that to determine that it does actually incorporate at the same rate. Yes, sir.
Earlier slide, but when you measure buffer on a slope plot, do you follow the slope or is it horizontal?
It's a horizontal dimension, and that's a good question. Good question. So if we have the question here is, how do you measure buffer where you have a steep slope? You don't go up the slope, you actually have to go horizontal from rest of vegetation into the site.
Plan view.
Yeah.
Good
Questions
question.
online?
Can the arborist allow substitutions for tree replacement selections?
Yes, she can, or yes, they can in this case. But again, it has to be reviewed and approved by the arborist.
And another one came in, for the purpose of runoff reduction to an addition to an existing impervious, is it permissible to intercept runoff of the existing impervious so long as the same calculated capture rate is used to satisfy, i.e. when no suitable area exists downhill of the addition?
I'm gonna turn this over to our city engineer, John Amfair.
Do you want me to repeat the question? All right. So the question is, for the purpose of runoff reduction to an addition to existing impervious, is it permissible to intercept runoff of the existing impervious so long as the same calculated capture rate is used to satisfy? The example is when no suitable area exists downhill of the addition.
The quick answer to that is yes. As long as it stays within the same drainage basin generally. We do allow you to offset impervious areas to collect that runoff reduction. As an example, if you're putting in a 2,000 square foot deck and pool, but are unable to capture that water specifically, you can capture 2,000 square feet or more of roof area and apply that to a runoff reduction.
In lieu of?
Best management practice.
So if you had an existing house?
Correct.
Gotcha. But for new construction, that would not be
For
possible,
new construction, that's typically not.
right? Because all of it would be required.
That's correct.
All right.
Yes, sir. So if I'm a homeowner and I'm thinking of doing a project, what number do I call to talk to somebody about the details of my project? How can the city help me when I'm just getting started?
Okay, thank you for the question. The question is, if I'm a new homeowner, how do I get someone to talk to me about this? I've got questions, I need answers. Who do I reach out to? So one, again, the city's call center, will direct it to community development, 770-730-5600. The city also provides Thursday meetings, every Thursday at 45-minute increments, which we're able to sit down with all of community development staff and look at your project, look at your question, and provide positive or sometimes negative feedback, because we have to tell you whether it's going to happen or it's not going to happen. But it's best to go take that step, take the initiative, call us. We are more than happy to sit down with you, discuss your concerns, and be able to provide whatever information is necessary. Okay. Also, if you do go on the city's website, there is a way to link in to our Thursday meeting and schedule one of those slots.
Right. They're very popular and they do book up. So I would recommend people, if you have something that you want to talk about, go ahead and get those scheduled ahead of time, because we do have limited spaces available, but they are very popular and we are there to help.
You can also come in person here at City Hall, and you can request to have a meeting set up. We are amenable. We have staff is available, that we're glad to come up front, talk with you, and explain the situation, and go through those processes.
Yeah.
Maybe worth mentioning we have a planner.
Sure.
In our permit office.
Thank you. Our city engineer just also mentioned that there is someone available, which is the planner of the day. It's our community development plan technician that can help to answer some questions. If they don't have an answer for you, we'll be glad to research and follow up with you. Additional questions? Any questions online?
Let's see. What do you do about runoff from a neighbor's property? water from the neighbor pours through my client's yard. Can't the city require the neighbor to arrest the neighbor to treat their own water?
I gotta think for a second here, so the honest answer is that is a civil matter between the two. If this is new construction, the construction as it was designed is supposed to imitate the pre-construction activities. So if water was naturally supposed to flow in this area, that homeowner has always had this water coming onto the property. We're not causing any additional runoff than what was there already. Okay? Now, if it's happening that something has occurred, your neighbor has disconnected some pipes or caused this situation to become a civil matter between the two. Again, we'll be glad to provide technical guidance on what should be done, but we're not in the enforcement or arresting your neighbor. Sorry.
Right. So if your neighbor happened to do some regrading or something like that, that would change the flow of the natural flow of the water prior to the construction, in which case that would typically be permitted. And that's why we have the impervious requirements that we do so that we can slow down that erosion or that overflow of water as it goes.
So in that case, for example, it would be a non-permitted activity or requiring permit. Code enforcement would go out to investigate and follow the judicial process that we have.
Right. If you suspect something like that does happen at someone else's property, you can always call that in at the city line. And if you want to remain anonymous, you can do that as well.
They wrote
But
in
you
more.
call it in. We have 4 code enforcement officers right now. We have 2 site inspectors, and we have a citizenry or population of over 100,000 people over 20 square miles. It's difficult to have eyes on it. So you all out in the field are our additional set of eyes. Any further questions? Okay. Recap again, this seminar will be available online. We're going to post PDF very shortly. I do want to take this moment to thank everyone here in person and those of you that are joining us online. Part of this informative meeting, we do try to have these seminars on a very regular basis. We do have some future seminars coming up. This is our upcoming slide will show you. So for example, we have a so designing signs that signage, very important for all of our commercial businesses here. Also how the property installed, hold down the neighborhood. This is more of a built construction related activity. And again, this is where we'll have the building official provide guidance and understanding of how that process is. And again, if you're in the city process or have to resubmit your drawings to try to get your project through, we'll give you a step-by-step guide on how to be able to submit properly, what pitfalls to look forward, not look forward to and avoid, but also be able to do, all right? So please complete the survey that we have here at the end of this process. We do appreciate you all being here. We'll have the survey up on the website just a little bit, so you can do so. All this information makes us do a better job in presenting in the future and are able to address a lot of these concerns for our customers. Should you all need it on screen right now, we've got our city arborist information and our city engineers information. Both Lindsay and John, as myself, we're here to help you in any way we can and answer questions that you have posed to our city staff. So in that, we'll close the seminar. I do really again want to thank you all for being here in person and those of you that are online with us as well. Thanks again, everybody. We look forward to the next seminar.
All right, great. Thanks, everybody. So we had, probably 10, 20, maybe close to 20 people inside, and we had almost 40 people online. So a great turnout. Thanks, everybody. I don't know who that is.